Good morning. Today is March 26, 2021. Today had the possibility of being a very important day. In another part of my blog, or my website, I had attempted to give information about a process I had begun last year of tracking economic activity in a particular manner. But it has come to my attention some things need to be addressed, and in the course of addressing them, they need to be closed out. Today would be the 1 year anniversary of a Treasury issue note that was meant to be a year long. It was 52 weeks. And I'd hoped that what would happen is that, in consideration of the way that I had set things up, even under the circumstances and with the intentions I did last year, that this would be the time to actually try to go through with a public process of correcting some wrongs, and doing what I could to be contributing to that possibility, specifically regarding transportation safety. Why? Well, we're going to get to that in the next video. But before we do that, I have to make an acknowledgement, and I'm going to try to say this as diplomatically as possible. At some point, it was decided that I personally was going to be a part of a specific kind of paradigm that I believe at the time was not very comprehensive, but was rather a sort of beta test, and depending on its success, may be implemented on a large scale, having to do with reform or recapitulation of the retirement system in the United States, specifically connected to veterans' benefits or benefits associated with members of the military. During the 1980s, there was a comprehensive pension reform for the United States military. It was reported on around the same time that the United States was implementing legislation concerning its intervention in Central America, specifically placing particular kinds of parameters around American intervention in Central America. Now, this was a long time ago. But one of the things that we are dealing with right now is the fact that people that were just, shall we say, cutting their teeth or getting the development for public office experience at the time in the 80s are in a different position now, including some of whom are still in public office. There's been a consistency in terms of their presence in the legislative or executive branches since that time. One of the things that happened is there was a report that was produced by the Congressional Research Service, which does various kinds of reports on federal legislation as well as other processes. And there was also information that was provided by others that were identifying and acknowledging the issues at hand, which was that in regards to the federal legislation that had gone through Congress, been passed by Congress, and signed into law by the President of the United States, that the project regarding the process concerning military pension benefits was to be a 40-year process, but they had only budgeted for up to 35. That after the 35th year, there just wasn't any specificity or identification of how they were going to address the funding shortfalls that would have been accrued by that time based on the projections and the methodology that they had agreed upon at the time they passed the bill. This is actually on the public record, this consideration. And in the mid 1980s, they were saying 40 years from now, we don't have the money to cover what just got approved through Congress. This was, again, the same time that they were dealing with legislation regarding American involvement in Central America. Within 2 years of that was Iran-Contra. We are now 40 years later. We are approaching the 40-year later mark. We are past year 35. Around this same time, there was also implementation through appropriations of something called a youth trust. It was meant to be for a drug-free America. Understanding is that this was supposed to be a trust for young people that had been identified as being of particular ages, including ages appropriate to get early drug interdiction information. I just so happen to have been one of those youth that would have been considered in terms of the primary age range for identification as a member of or to be availed of the benefits of that youth trust. Now, when I was growing up, they didn't tell me about that element. What I do know is that me and my sister one day went down to the local mall. They had a project there, a process there. They made an announcement to the members of the community. There was an FBI program regarding missing children, and that in order for parents to protect against the potential that their children could be abducted and that they would not be able to identify their child in the case of something happening, or their child may be exposed to crime, and there may be a need for law enforcement to intercede in order to address those factors. That they were having a public day where law enforcement was going to provide fingerprint cards. Me and my sister went with my mother down to the mall. I remember it very distinctly. We got those fingerprint cards, and the understanding was we kept a copy, and that there was a database somewhere that had registered that me and my sister had gotten our fingerprints that day. So that in case law enforcement had need of information connected to our fingerprints in order to identify us being involved in any crime, it would have been available. My understanding is that those fingerprint cards and those various events where young people with their parents were fingerprinted ostensibly in order to prevent against there not being a possibility of law enforcement to do the most that it could do in order to prevent against child abduction and or abuse or exploitation of a child based on abduction were securitized or were secured in some manner, that they are backed by what is supposed to be the good faith and credit of the United States of America, including through federal law enforcement. We're talking about children. I was not even 10 years old at the time, if I recall correctly. Neither was my little sister. It's something else that despite everything else that's happened in my life, I remember that event very distinctly. I can see it right now as I'm making this video. The mall, where my mother sat, how we lined up, how many people were there. The room off to the side with different lighting, the way the tables were set up. I can literally see it right now while I'm talking to you. That is very profound. And it also lets me know, in a form of what you could say is visual acknowledgement, that it was actually that profound. Now we are in a situation where my understanding is that elements of my life were allowed to be assigned or ascribed by somebody else as being made available for their retirement. And I am in the situation I'm in, and I've been very limited in the last 4 years to 5 years specifically of who I'm even allowed to be in a room with. This was before COVID-19, by the way. My conversations had a time limit, by and large, maximum 1 hour, as if they're billing by the hour. And the possibilities for social interaction usually have a time commitment associated with them, wherein I am supposed to convey, and if I don't, there's no more time left for me. Now, my concern is that what has happened is that people in the 80s, including people that were in Congress and the Senate that approved that military pension package and also approved the Trust for a Drug-Free Youth and also approved what was supposed to be official policy regarding American intervention in Central America, and also handled Iran-Contra the way they did, including with the limitations on actual prosecutions. And those people knew exactly what they were doing. And they also knew exactly what they felt like they were entitled to expect around their retirement. Especially when, years down the road, We have the kind of reforms, so called reforms, to the retirement system overall, including recapitulation of concepts of the availability of annuities for members of the military when it comes to their potential commingling in various investment schemes, and the recapitulation of various kinds of military hardware as a form of surplus, including surplus that could be made available to local law enforcement. I know exactly what you did, and I also know you can't cover it. And you can't actually fulfill certain obligations unless you get me to consent. I'm not going to pay for your sexual harassment insurance. I'm not going to pay for your cyber insurance. Both of those would have been covered under the terrorism risk insurance program that was set up after September 11th. But now we're at a situation where it seems that the terrorism risk insurance program set up after September 11th was itself a part of this premeditated paradigm that began in the 1980s, and that it also was intentionally defrauded, hoping that successful accomplishment of defrauding the federal government and hence the people of the United States of America in such a monumental manner would provide other kinds of insurance, like political risk insurance, like criminal liability insurance, for the very people that set up the scheme and tried to operationalize it for the last 40 years. I have no intention of paying for that either. Now, before I was aware, I made a engagement, I guess you could call. I was offered an opportunity to provide a work product. And in consideration of that work product, I was requested to provide writing samples to demonstrate my proficiency and capabilities for the topic at hand. And I did. I now understand that on some level, somebody considered the fact that I had provided those specific writing samples to be akin to allowing for the person I provided them to and the context in which they were provided to appropriate it and to appropriate the other kinds of human and other capital that were reflected in those writing samples as their own. And they have been using that as part of their retirement. I mean, they're still active. They're of retirement age and eligible to be availed of retirement benefits, right? But there were certain obligations somebody else signed me up for if I wanted to get compensation, including the kind of compensation that would allow me, for instance, to pay my legal fees, pay my court filing fees, be able to afford my own mortgage, be able to acquire a line of credit for my small business. But I did not do those things. Instead, the rest of my human capital has been appropriated, and it's now some reason allowed to be given over to him and to the people with whom he's working for their own purposes. So I'm going to have to reevaluate my perspective. There was plenty that he did not get and should not have been able to access just by virtue of the fact that he had been provided with those writing samples in consideration of my capabilities. By the way, there has never been any disclosure. There has never been any confirmation, and there's never been any acknowledgement that people who were in public office when I was a minor, below the age of consent, took out loans using projections of my capabilities, including capabilities assessed through testing of my mental functioning, i.e., an IQ test, that at some point qualified me to be considered a gifted student, and decided they were going to work my credit or my future for themselves, and then require me to engage in sexual activity as a way to confirm ex post facto I would have consented to them trafficking me since I was a minor for their own political priorities. I didn't. I won't. And I won't accept or allow for anybody to think I would have agreed, condoned, or supported them doing that to any other minor. There should already have been implementation of a mandated savings program. When I was in high school, there was a Secretary of the Treasury who discussed on the public record at the time the concept of mandated savings program. He's also somebody I understand had an extensive history and experience with derivative agreements. Well, he's dead now. And that mandated savings program did not get appropriately fleshed out, and it did not get appropriately considered, especially considered in the context of understanding that had it been applied in the mid 1990s, instead of allowing for a false paradigm under the auspices of intelligence recruitment to allow for people that somehow were able to get elected to public office to take out loaners on precocious and specifically demographically comported teenagers as a way to re-up on what they had already taken out as loaners on them before they were teenagers. So that then we would have to spend the rest of our lives being sexually shamed into silence and acquiescence to what they had done to us since we were little children. We would be in a very different situation right now. We wouldn't have the need of importation of child assets from other countries in order to offset our liabilities. And we wouldn't have the need to have covered up for what really happened with DACA and DAPA. We also wouldn't have the need to try to create this horrorscape where we bribe teachers into acquiescence themselves about teaching in classrooms where their students are being electronically sexually exploited right before their faces. We'd be in a very different situation. And in order for me to, what do they say? Improvise, adapt, overcome the current context of the situation, which, by the way, has never acknowledged anything about what I personally did in consideration of anybody else's credit for being a member of the military, including my own, then I'm going to have to apply that policy of improvising, adapting, and overcoming. So I'm going to have to recomport my efforts moving forward with an understanding of those 3 articles and the topics specific to those 3 articles, at least for the time being, are being put into an interest-bearing escrow account pending the resolution of the criminal prosecutions that they're connected to. And I'm going to try to move forward in a recapitulation and recontextualization of my past human capital that has not already been allowed to be appropriated illegally by other people that agreed to traffic children for their concept of creditability. So I will do that with the next video.